My main area of research has to do with labor market institutions and their impact on employment, wages, income, and earning distributions. I think this is very important because labor markets are not as sometimes are being described in some textbook. So places where in a way labor supply and labor demand meet, workers find a job, often losing a job is not a big deal, are way more complicated and are markets where there are many institutions operating, such as collective bargaining institutions, setting wages, unemployment benefit systems, providing income support to those losing a job, employment protection legislation, increasing or reducing the cost of dismissal for firms. So one has to understand why all of these institutions are in place, what role they play, and what are the consequences of adjusting this institution, as often governments do. So it's a basis to understand many real life situations. As a matter of fact, these days I'm here at LISER to work with my colleague Jan van Oers on a new edition of our textbook, which is called Imperfect Labor Market, because we really want to acknowledge the fact that modern labor markets are crowded by all of these institutions, and we have to understand what role they play, why they are there, why our democracies are being electing government that have introduced these institutions. We learn a lot from the Great Recession. First of all, we learn a lot about the links between financial markets and labor markets. That's an area where there has not been much research before the Great Recession. There was quite a lot after that. No doubt, financial crisis, liquidity constraints put on firms do affect very much employment. And we had that countries that had relatively well-developed financial markets suffered the most from the crisis, especially at the outset. Think about the US or the UK. They really suffered very large employment losses as a result of this financial crisis. Very important links between finance and the labor market that had been overlooked before. We also learn a lot about the specific role of labor market institutions. Some countries went through a very bad, nasty crisis without experiencing major employment losses. This is because they had some institutions that prevented this from occurring. One very important institution was short-time work. Short-time work is an institution that subsidizes reduction in working hours without affecting very much incomes or earnings of the workers being redundant, and allow firms to keep in the firm workers reducing their hours of work without laying them off. That's very important for firms that have to keep in their functioning human capital, experience. They don't want to lose their workers if they suffer a rather temporary crisis. And the Great Recession was a relatively temporary shock. And as soon as matter improved, these firms were able to recover all their workforce without having major losses in terms of human capital. So short-time work was a very important institution that played a very important role in the context of the Great Recession. Other institutions that played an important role were employment protection legislation that had a double role, because employment protection legislation is a bit a more tricky institution, because often when you have strict employment protection legislation, that's something that should reduce dismissals. However, often strict employment protection legislation goes hand in hand with a dual labor market structure, where you have a lot of temporary workers who are really not protected by cost of dismissals. We noticed that in the countries that had a lot of these dual markets, you also got very large employment losses, because all the adjustment was concentrated on these workers, often are young workers with temporary contracts. So that's another very important institution playing a role. Finally, wage setting institutions were also important because you had to allow for some wage adjustment. Sometimes allowing wages to go down was a way to avoid to lay off workers. And some countries do allow wages to adjust more than others. Others are constrained by very strict collective bargaining system, centralized collective bargaining system, not allowing wages to adjust to shocks like those that we have been experiencing in that case.
Yes, I have a very broad area of labor market research. So I've looked in the past at the effectiveness of all kinds of labor market policies. But recently I'm focusing on what are the determinants of employment among older individuals. How do older individuals perceive their health? And how does retirement, for example, affect the health of the individuals that retire? So I think the main issue is that if you look back over the past decades, there has been a huge increase in labor market participation of older workers. So more older workers now face the choice to go on early retirement or to stay on, much more than a few decades ago. At the same time, the retirement age is slowly increasing, the mandatory retirement age. And that means that if there is an effect of retirement on health, that's a policy relevant issue to know what the consequences of retirement are. And so far, the findings indicate that if people retire, their mental health improves, which is good. But if the retirement age is slowly going up, that means that people experience this increase in mental health at a later age. Having said that, as often, this effect is not the same across the board because it depends, for example, on your family situation. And roughly, retirement is a happy experience for people with a partner, but a less happy experience for people who are single. So it turns out that people who are single are not very happy if they retire. And this may have to do with social relations, with loneliness and stuff like that. Yes, I find it very hard to say something about this is a typical area that will prosper in the next decade or so. What I do notice is that there is much more information available to investigate the behavior of participants in the labor market. And like in the old days is not that long ago, say 25 years, we had data sets which had 30 observations, 30 years of observations, and that's there we had to draw conclusions from a limited set of data. And more recently, now we have, say, we know how people behave over a period of 10 years. We can follow them over time. You have 10,000, 100,000 or even more observations. So that makes it possible to go much more in depth of understanding how people respond to all kinds of incentives, for example. So it's not the case that I can sort of highlight an area which is interesting for future research. It's more the methodology. We know much more about individuals than we knew for a long time, and that knowledge is increasing further. Now we also get information which we couldn't dream of. Many countries are now looking like Scandinavian countries, where basically we know everything from hour to hour almost what people do, and that means that we can also track what the effects of certain changes in policy are, or whether if you reach a certain age, you can choose something different which you couldn't choose before that reaching that age. We can investigate that in much more detail. Having said that, it also becomes more complex because effects are often very heterogeneous. They work for some individuals but not for others. So I guess that the young people will have to deal with big data sets and try to find an answer that is common to many people, although I'm sure that's not possible to the extent that there will always be heterogeneity. But basically, I think in the near future, or even now already, we will be more able to come up with policy advice than we were in the past.